All right, if we can turn to Revelation chapter 6, and we are up to the sixth seal tonight. Can I get someone to read that out for me? Revelation 6, verse 12 to 17.
I can do that if you like.
Yep.
So 12 to 17.
Mm-hmm.
And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?
So under the seal, we see things seem to be changing again. It seems to be describing a different type of events. What was the nature of and the character of the seals under the first four? What was the images we saw?
There were riders.
Mm-hmm.
More the religious side of things, wasn't it?
Persecution and destruction. No, destruction as in the persecution.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All these things. There's this religious idea of this gospel going forward. There's this persecution. There's this destruction. There's this heavily symbolic nature of these riders on the horse. And this is consistent through the first four seals. And in the fifth seal, we see a slight change. It's no longer talking about the horsemen, okay? But there's still this strongly symbolic nature, but it's talking about a scene happening within a sanctuary setting. The souls crying out under the altar. But then under the sixth seal, it is a change again. What is the type of things that's being described under the sixth seal in contrast to the highly symbolic nature of these previous five?
Literal. Like in the physical world, like an actual thing happening.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it is not symbolic.
So, yeah, so there's a change. It seems to be describing events that are far more literal than what's come before. We've moved from this highly symbolic ones, giving us, an idea to interpret these things to understand what would happen. But now, as we're getting right up to the end, it switches and it starts describing these very literal events that are taking place. And what does this lead up to? What's happening at the end of this seal?
The second coming.
What are the people crying out?
Rocks and mountains to fall on them.
And
hide them from the face of the Lamb.
Yeah, so they're witnessing the second coming. It's describing the lost, they're witnessing the second coming. So this the sixth seal takes us right up to the second coming. The people are witnessing that happen. But I want to look at a bit of where does the seal begin? Okay, if we're going to get a time frame, it runs up to the second coming. But some of these earlier events, when are we looking at these events to start? Now, some of the early events it mentions a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. The moon became as blood. Stars falling from heaven, and then it leads right up into the second coming. Now, these events, or at least many of them, draw parallels to what Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, when he was asked about the second coming and what would happen. So if we can turn to Matthew 24. And can I get someone to read Matthew 24, verse 29 to 31?
I'll read that, Matthew. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of God in heaven. Then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other.
So what are the similar events that Jesus mentioned there that we saw in Revelation? What are the same type of things that they mentioned?
The signs in the sky.
Yep. He mentions the sun being dark, and the moon, the stars falling from heaven, the powers of heaven being shaken. Okay. Now in Revelation, it mentioned a previous sign. It says an earthquake, and then it went on to the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay, so it mentions one earlier sign, but here Jesus starts with the signs of the heaven, the sun, moon, and stars. And he gives us a timing for when we expect to start seeing these events. What is the timing when he says that these events are to start occurring?
Immediately after the tribulation of those days.
So he's referring to that. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, we're going to start seeing these events happening. So the question is, what is those days that he's referring to? What is the tribulation of those days? So to understand that, we've got to jump back earlier in the chapter. And can I get someone to read from verse 15 through to 20?
What chapter?
Matthew 24, still in that same chapter.
And what verse?
Verse 15 through to 20. And we're just going to run through what Jesus has previously talked about, so we can find out what is the tribulation of those days that he's meaning. So read Matthew 24, verse 15 to 20, and we'll ask the question, what event is this talking about?
I'll read it. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day.
So what is Jesus speaking about there? Has anyone looked into this, about what this abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet that was standing in the holy places?
Isn't that the standard that when they attacked Jerusalem, that was put up by the Romans?
Yep. When the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem and they're about to destroy it, Jesus says, when you see that happening, when you see that abomination of desolation surrounding Jerusalem, surrounding God's holy city where he put his name, okay, flee. Now, that they couldn't flee when it first happened because the city was surrounded. But God provides a way where things look impossible from our point of view and we cannot see a way through it. God provided a way. And there came to be some political turmoil happening in Rome, and the general who was to be emperor had to leave Jerusalem and go back to Rome to become emperor. And during that time, all the Christians left. And then later on, Titus came back with the armies, surrounded Jerusalem again and completely destroyed it. But Jesus there was speaking of this, and he told the Christians, when this happened, flees. So this is our first point here. And just to back this up, I just want to read the parallel passage in Luke. Can someone read Luke 21, verse 20 to 21?
And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto.
Mm-hmm. So there in Matthew, he records Jesus saying the abomination of desolation. And when you see that, let those that be in Judea flee to the mountains. In Luke, it just says, when Jerusalem is encompassed with armies, then let those that in Judea flee to the mountains. So in Luke, it just tells us the interpretation of what that was, whereas in Matthew, it tells us, you know, the scriptures that Jesus was referring to. So we know here that Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that happened. And following that, can somebody read in Matthew 24, jump back into Matthew 24, verse 21 to 23.
I'll read that, Matthew. For then
Yep.
shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there shall no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not.
So as Jesus is looking down to the big prophetic events happening between there and the second coming, he describes the destruction of Jerusalem. And then the next thing he describes, but between here and then these signs that are to come, is this great tribulation. And he sort of just sums it up in, you know, a few sentences, just this great tribulation that had not, you know, that there would be no such time since that, nor ever will be. Does anyone have any ideas what this could be referring to?
The Dark Ages and the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's referring to that time of tribulation, which we've been looking at as we go through the seals. You know, if you remember, we went through the seals. There is this time of death, of war, so much so that the saints, you know, as we saw last week, that the voice of the martyrs crying out under the altar, saying, "How long, O Lord?" Referring to this period of great tribulation that the earth had been through. Now we're just going to compare this again to Luke 21, because in Luke 21, it's described slightly differently. Can somebody read from verse 22 through to 24?
It's all quiet, so I'll read. 22 to 24, for these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword. They shall be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
So, and Matthew just talks about this great tribulation. Here, he carries on and he talks about the time of the Gentiles. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And what is the very next thing he says in the next verse?
Are you referring to the second coming in verse 25?
Yeah, in verse 25, yeah, it starts speaking about the same signs in the sun, moon, stars, you know, and he starts going into these same things. So in Matthew 24, he speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem, the great tribulation, and then signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Here in Luke, he speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem, the time of the Gentiles, and then the sun, moon, and stars. So we understand that in Matthew, the great tribulation parallels within Luke what he's talking about with the time of the Gentiles. And so we have a question, this time of the Gentiles, what does that mean? And what is that referring to? Yes, Gayleen?
The only thing that would make sense, well, to me, is the fact that the 70 years had finished at Stephen in 34 AD, and then the gospel went out to the Gentiles. So it would be those that were not be talking about a time that like didn't involve the Jews, like literal Jews, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, that is one way to look at it. I think it's being a little more specific than that. I think here that the time of the Gentiles is actually referring to a specific period. Because if you go through scripture, there's one other thing that's mentioned to do with the Gentiles and a time period, and we actually find that back in Revelation. Does someone want to turn to Revelation chapter 11? In the beginning of Revelation 11, John's told to measure the temple. And can somebody read for us Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2? And I want to just think of the parallels between what we're reading here and what Jesus said in Matthew 24 about Jerusalem being trodden underfoot until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
And there was given me a rod like a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months.
So what are the parallels we find there between Luke 21 and Revelation 11?
Time of the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. And what are the Gentiles doing in this time?
Tread underfoot.
Mm-hmm.
What? The holy city.
Yep. In Revelation 11, it says that the holy city shall they tread underfoot. And in Luke 21, it says Jerusalem shall be trodden underfoot of the Gentiles. So in both passages, the Gentiles are said to be treading Jerusalem underfoot. In Luke, it just says, you know, until the time is fulfilled. But in Revelation, it actually tells us what that time is. What is the time of the Gentiles where they shall tread Jerusalem underfoot?
42 months.
Hmm.
Sorry, 42 prophetic months.
Yep. And so what is that if we expand that out to literal years?
1260.
Mm-hmm. So we have this 1260-year period. And when it's talking about, you know, Jerusalem, the holy city here, and the Gentiles, I don't see this as referring to literal. You know, it's not referring to literal Jerusalem or literal Gentiles. It's transition into speaking about spiritual Jews, God's people spiritually. And so it's talking about, you know, the Gentiles, those who aren't God's people, will be trampling down his people for 1260 years. Okay, that's what's being spoken of here in Luke. And so when we jump back into Matthew 24, when Jesus talks about there being a great tribulation, okay, in verse 21, for there shall be a great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor shall there be. He's referring to the time of the Gentiles in Luke, which is the 1260 years that we're given in Revelation 11. So that's the tribulation that Jesus is speaking of. The 1260-year period of the Antichrist reign, that little horn of Daniel, the beast of Revelation 13. This time period comes up again and again through these different prophecies, pointing to this power that would attack and persecute God's people for over 1,000 years. But he says something in verse 22 about this tribulation. What does he say? This is back in Matthew 24, verse 22.
Except those days be shortened.
And that's one thing we see, the 1260 years. We have that starting in 538, going through to 1798, right? But the persecution that God's people suffered under that time actually sort of began to be curbed before the end of it. It began to be shortened, okay? It didn't extend right to the end. So while that 1260-year reign of that power lasted until 1798, the time of persecution during that was shortened.
It was due to William of Orange, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know any more than that, just that it was because of him.
Yep, that's right.
Was he Dutch?
Yes.
I was just thinking orange just makes it, the immediate association I have would be with the Dutch. So was he to do with the Reformation?
Don't know. He must have had some influence there, obviously. Don't know.
Either before or after or something?
I'm not too sure exactly what part he had to play in it. I have heard his name come up, but I'm not completely sure what part he had to play in it. But I know he was there. But anyway, we have this time of tribulation happening, but the persecution in that day being cut short. Okay, now jump back down into Matthew 24, verse 29, when Jesus tells us the time that this persecution would start. What does he say?
What verse?
Matthew 24, 29.
29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shall be shaken.
Mm-hmm. So those days is referring to the 1260 years, and immediately after the tribulation or the persecution in those days, that tribulation that was cut short in those days, that we should see the first one of these signs, the sun being darkened. So we know that those days extended to 1798, but the tribulation in those days was cut short. So we're looking just after the persecution of those days, just prior to the end of those days, this first sign of the sun being darkened. And if you just type in Google the dark day, it will come up with a date. Yeah, May 19, 1780 is known as the dark day, the day that the sun did not shine. I've got a map here. I'm going to show us the extent of it. It was mainly in the top part of North America. I'll share my screen here. Right, so the records show that it was in 1780, from Maine, which is up here, down to New Jersey. So it's in this northeastern part of North America. For the entire day, it was dark. The reports from that day was that, you know, you could not see your hands in front of your face. If you held a piece of white paper up in front of your face at noonday, you could not see it. Complete darkness over this part of America. And that landed right in that time where Jesus tells us the first of these signs was to begin happening. So jump back to Revelation 6. So under the sixth seal there, when it says the sun became black as sackcloth of hair. Okay, in 6 verse 12. And so we have that dark day affecting that northeastern part of North America. For the entire day, the sun did not shine any light. It was darker during the day than it was during the night. You didn't even have starlights or anything. But Revelation 6 here, verse 12, speaks of one sign coming before that. What does Revelation 6 tell us happened before the sun became black as sackcloth?
A great earthquake.
A great earthquake happened. Now, earthquakes have always happened. But when I was looking into this particularly strong earthquake happening before that great day, one came up that many of us have probably heard of, the Lisbon earthquake. Happened on November 1st, 1755. I'll share my screen again, and here we go. Now, here's Lisbon on the coast by Portugal. The epicenter of the earthquake was just about here, somewhere, about, I think, 200-300 kilometers off the coast. And I was heard the Lisbon earthquake. I was like, okay, so it destroyed Lisbon, and estimates between about 50,000 and 90,000 people died in that earthquake, just in Lisbon alone, which was quite substantial. One of the reasons it was such a great loss of life, it happened at 20 to 10 in the morning on the Feast of All Saints. So many people were all in their churches, and these stone churches all collapsed and crushed people. That's why so many died. But I just thought, okay, this Lisbon earthquake, a big earthquake affecting one city, didn't seem significant enough to make it in, but it wasn't until I actually started looking at some of the records that I realized how big the earthquake was. It didn't just hit Lisbon. Lisbon was took the brunt of it, but there was also a large amount of loss of life throughout Morocco. This whole area was quite devastated, but the earthquake was felt throughout all of Europe and North Africa. There was even reports of it being felt in Greenland and America. So you think it's an earthquake that shock was felt right across the Atlantic Ocean. So if you just think of its epicenters there, the earthquake was felt on that much of the earth. So that shows you the size and the power of that actual earthquake. I think 4 million square miles was what I seen that they said it was felt across. So when you realize that the shock of the earthquake was throughout all of Europe, North Africa, and right across the Atlantic, it shows you the actual extent and how violent that earthquake was. So it wasn't just a Lisbon earthquake, it was actually a half the world sort of earthquake that it was felt across. As just the destruction in Lisbon was you know, so catastrophic. You know, like I said, 50 to 90,000 people died, and that also had a huge flow-on effect throughout the area, as far as many people in the church blaming it on the sins of the people for this happening, and it ramped up a lot of the religious zeal among many. So we have that the Great Lisbon earthquake happening in 1755, the sun being black as sackcloth in May of 1780, and actually something I should have covered before, reports on that day when the sun became black also mention that the moon being full red before it disappeared into the blackness as well. So there was that blood moon happening on that same day. So it says the sun became black as sackcloth and the moon became as blood. Then jump back into Revelation 6. In verse 13, the next sign we see is the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. Now, the first of these, what has since become known as was it Leonid meteor showers, happened in 1799, and that one happened over Central America. It was observed in the southern parts of the United States and Venezuela. So again, I'll share this. So looking on a map here. So we've got observers of it in Venezuela and right up to the southern part of the United States here, all this area experiencing these, you know, this meteor showers where it just looked like the entire sky was covered with falling stars for several hours on end. But the most spectacular one of these happened a little bit later in 1833, on the night of November 12, going into the morning of November 13, where for 4 hours, over 1 billion shooting stars fell. And this was over sort of Canada, United States area around here. And that one was described as people witnessing it, saying it came from a single point spreading out over the sky. One report described it as looking like the ribs of a giant umbrella, how they start at one point and sort of curve down. And so for 4 hours, over 1 billion stars, shooting stars, fell down from the sky over that part of the world. Now, I found it interesting. There was also a slightly smaller one in 1866, leading up there, and that led scientists to say, oh, it's just this regular occurrence. And so they predicted the next few ones when it would all happen, and they were sitting there waiting, but they didn't happen again. And so it's just these three falling of the stars happening over different parts of the world, over America. And yeah, just amazing. 4 hours, over 1 billion shooting stars falling from what looked like a single point in the sky, spanning outwards. So if we jump back there into Revelation 6. So Revelation 6. So it talks about the sixth seal opening, a great earthquake. Okay, we have the Lisbon earthquake, which was of tremendous power and ferocity. The sun became black as sackcloth, which happened there on the dark day in 1780. Okay, with the blood moon on the same night. The stars falling from heaven, which happened a few years later in 1799, and again a big one in 1833. And the next thing we read is the heavens depart as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of its place. Now that's something that hasn't yet happened. So that tells us where we are in the history of these 7 seals. Okay, we've gone through the 4 horsemen, through the 5th seal, looked at the fulfillment of this and how it's unfolded under history. And I find it interesting when we get right near to the end with the seal that leads us right up to the second coming, suddenly these signs get very literal. It's like looking over the sort of the arch of Christian history. We had all these symbolic horsemen and stuff. God was, again, wanting to show us what happened, but as well give us these principles to understand that he was in control, that these things were to happen, but you know, it would pass, it would move on. But coming right up to the second coming, he gives us several very clear, very literal signs that could not be mistaken. So we know, yes, these things are happening leading up here, you know, right up to, you know, into the mid 1800s, into just before we have the, you know, the cleansing of the sanctuary and that whole movement coming up. And so that's where we are right there, between verse 13 and 14. And so in verse 14, when we read there, the heavens depart as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island moved out of its place. What is this talking about? Okay, when is this happening? Can somebody read for me Revelation 16 and verse 20?
I can do that.
Yep, thank you.
And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people and they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe.
So this is speaking about those same events. Every mountain, you know, fled away, and every island was moved out of its place and disappeared. But here in Revelation 16, where is this? What is happening here?
Sounds like one of the 7 plagues.
Yep.
Because the plague, because it's the plague of hail. Every stone about the weight of a talent. I mean, we get big, we don't here, but in America and what have you, in some places you see hailstones the size of baseballs. They're huge, and they do horrendous damage both to, stock, unfortunately, but also, man-made objects and bits and pieces.
Yep. It is one of the plagues. It's actually the 7th and the final plague that happens in verse 17. It talks about the 7th angel poured out his vial. Now, what event happens just before the plagues start getting poured out?
Close of probation.
So that tells us that the events in verse 14, or at least the last part of verse 14, take place under the plagues, after the close of probation. So, Margaretha, did you have something?
I did, but I'll have to go in a minute because I've got a spasm just started. But I just wanted to say, do you think all those things will happen again just before Christ comes, before the sky opens? In Isaiah 12, 9 and 10, it says, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, both cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine, and I will punish the world for their evil. So that's speaking about those things, or doesn't mention the stars in that one, but just before the second coming. So even though it's true regarding the historic ones, that sets us into a time of history. But this one appears to show that it will all happen again before Jesus comes. Do you think that might be right?
I would definitely agree with you there. There's several different things in scripture that we see that seem to indicate that a lot of these events that have happened sort of like throughout history, that they're also being sort of a repeat of them in a condensed and intensified version right at the end. And so, like you said, like in Isaiah there, it describes these similar events, but it places them right at the end. So yes, I would agree with that.
Okay.
Now, can somebody read from back in Revelation 6, verse 15 through to 17? And so we've covered that this, but in Revelation 6, sorry, at the 6th seal, where we've transitioned past the close of probation here. So from Revelation 15 onwards, this is happening after the close of probation, okay, after when these plagues are being poured out. So can someone read this Revelation 6, verse 15 through to 17.
I'll read it, Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
And the kings of the earth and the great men and the rich men and the chief captains and the mighty men, every bondsman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. Excuse me. Said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?
Hmm. Now, the people there that are running and crying, what type of people is it describing? Who is included in this group?
Everyone from the great men and the kings right down to every free man and every bondsman, everybody.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is jumping a bit ahead, but I'm sure we're all familiar with some of the passages further on in Revelation, like in chapter 13, 17, and 18, that deal with the final persecuting power, the beast in his image, when all the world wanders after the beast, all the world receives the mark and supports the system that is persecuting God's people. And God's people are forced to flee. And here at the end, we find that everyone, rich, free, poor, kings, rulers, great men, whoever they are now fleeing to the rocks and the mountains. But they are not fleeing there to survive. They're actually fleeing there, asking for those rocks and mountains to fall on them and to destroy them, and to hide them from the wrath of the Lamb, him that sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. And what is the final question they ask in verse 17?
Who shall be able to stand?
So when they're asking that question, it sort of tells you a bit about their experience, their mindset under this time. What are they experiencing? What is their view of what's happening?
It's not a celebration, but they're talking about there's only going to be two groups. Those that welcome this, who are able to stand, and this group who just want to hide their face away because they can't stand. So you've got the righteous who are standing, who are able to stand, and you've got the wicked who cannot stand.
Yep. And from their point of view, everything is being destroyed. And so they're crying out that the day of God's wrath has come, and they leave us with the question, who shall be able to stand? Okay. In their minds, no one can stand this. Everyone's going to be destroyed. And so that it leaves us at the end of the sixth seal with that question, who shall be able to stand? And what we're going to look at next week, I'm just going to give a bit of a teaser, is how does the book of Revelation answer that question? Okay, how does it answer that question, who shall be able to stand? And so at the end of chapter 6, we are given the sixth seal. The seventh seal starts in 8 verse 1. It says, and when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven the space of half an hour. So the sixth seal finishes at the end of chapter 6, and the seventh seal starts at the end of chapter 8. Yes, Galen.
I was just thinking, those that see these happenings, the second coming as a giant calamity, as destruction, as you say, that no one's going to be able to survive this, because who shall be able to stand is almost like a rhetorical question for them. But my question is, when they say to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him, that sitteth on the throne, are we told anywhere if that request is granted or not? Because for that to be granted doesn't make much sense, because when Christ comes back with the glory of his Father, his own glory, and every single angel and all their glory, they're not going to be able to stand, because God is a consuming fire. So that they're not going to, it's just not going to work. But to me, it doesn't make much sense if that request was granted, because then there's not as much realization as there would be if they were to stay there and be consumed by Christ's holiness. If that, does that make sense? I'm sorry, I'm probably not very clear.
No, when we look at other passages, like in Peter in Revelation 19, when it looks at the second coming, it talks about them being destroyed by the brightness of his coming. That's the imagery we get. And so I would say no, that they're seeing, the face of him that sits on the throne and the wrath of the Lamb coming. They're seeing the brightness of the second coming, and we're told that at first, as Jesus mentioned in Matthew 21, the sign of the Son of Man shall be seen in heaven. And so we can see his coming a distance off before he gets here. Okay, and at some point that this terror strikes the people, and they're running and hiding. But as Christ comes, they are destroyed by the brightness of his coming. Okay, but in this period of terror just before the destruction, they cry out that question: who shall be able to stand? Okay, and chapter 6 finishes with that, and then we've got this interlude in chapter 7. Okay, because the next seal starts again at the beginning of chapter 8. And the reason it pauses on the seals is because it's trying to answer that question. We're left with the question, who shall be able to stand? And what does chapter 7 tell us? What's the very next thing we read in chapter 7?
And after these things, I saw, and after these things, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree.
So they're holding back the destruction that is being described there. Why are they doing that?
And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. So the sealing of God's people has to be made sure to be completed.
Because before God will allow that calamity to unfold that we read about in the 6th seal, God will have a people who will be able to stand. The 144,000 are the answer to their question. When they cry out, who shall be able to stand? Revelation immediately presents us with the 144,000 in chapter 7 as the ones who will be able to stand in that time with no mediator, in that time after the close of probation, when these people are running and crying for the rocks to fall on us. God's people are going to be crying, this is our God, we have waited for him.